And we're live. Friends from around the world, welcome to Solha. Today we have a very exciting community project. Now, what is a community project? These are potentially our most interesting live streams. They're episodes and sessions that our community members come up with and produce themselves. So aside from doing this little intro, I did not have anything to do with what you're about to see. If anybody watching this has some ideas that they'd like to bring to life, reach out to me. Let's do it. That's what we're all about, doing things together as a community. I'm not going to say much more, just the basics. If you're new to this channel, please like and subscribe. A shout out to our Patreon visionary members. We have Trivium Energy Pty Ltd. We have SOG Cannabis, and we have Max Marine. If you want to be a Patreon visionary member, you can find a link to our Patreon in the link below. And even if you're not a visionary member, all patrons help us make this content and really help us aid in the reconciliation process. That's what we're all about. Like always, we're going to do an after party in Discord. You can find a link to Discord in the description. After party is essentially just continuing the conversation, but where the community can join in on the conversation. Without further ado, it's an honor to bring on Rafi Gassel, who actually is the community member who thought of this project. So, Rafi, I'm gonna leave you and enjoy.
Thanks, Adar. Hi, my name is Rafi. I live in Jerusalem, Israel. I work in biotechnology and next generation sequencing, DNA research. And on the side, I'm also involved in peace activism and reaching out to people in the Palestinian community and finding ways to move forward together. So tonight we're going to talk about In Search of a Common Narrative, the history of Israel-Palestine. We're going to talk about genetic research. Over the past 20 years or so, there's been a series of genetic studies on Jews and Palestinians showing a significant amount of common ancestry. And we're going to talk about what that means to us and how we interpret that for ourselves and in the world of coexistence. So my special guests tonight are Tsvi Misinai and Dr. Carl Soraki. So Tsvi Misinai is an Israeli researcher, an author, historian, computer scientist, and entrepreneur, a graduate in physics from the Haifa Technion University, a pioneer in the Israeli software industry, won in 1992 the Rothschild Award for industrial development, the first one in the field of software, the founder and the first president of Sapiens International Corporation, whose technology and development started under his leadership in 1972 in the Weizmann Institute of Science. Since 2000, Tsvi spends most of his time researching and documenting the common Hebrew roots shared by world Jewry and the Palestinians, and designing a win-win peace solution based on his findings. He wrote several books on the subjects, and several short documentaries and interviews with him were prepared and aired for Israeli TV. Dr. Carl Soraki. Carl was born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, received his master's degree from the University of Toronto. He's pursued a postgraduate clinical and research training in internal medicine, nephrology, and molecular biology at Brigham and Women's and Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard University. In January 1999, Carl and his family moved to Israel, subsequently joining the Rambam Medical Center and Technion's Faculty of Medicine in Haifa. Between the years 1995 and 2005, he served as the director of nephrology department in Rambam until recently director of medical and research development. He also served as director of the Rappaport Research Institute between 2000 and 2015, launching major novel research programs in stem cell and human genetics research, establishing the Institute's technology transfer company, and overseeing the institution's budget. Professor Soraki is currently the dean of Bar-Ilan University, Azrieli Faculty of Medicine in Tzfat. Carl's current major research interests are human population and molecular genetics, having started with research studies tracing founding patrilineal and matrilineal lineages in Near East and Jewish populations, which has now been extended to genome-wide studies, including many global populations, with an emphasis on kidney disease population disparities. His research has been reported in leading scientific and medical journals and books with more than 250 publications and close to 8,000 citations. Carl has delivered multiple endowed lectures at leading universities throughout the world and premier scientific conferences. Carl has served and continues to serve on numerous institutional, national, and international advisory boards and committees. And most recently, Carl was elected as a member of the Council of the Israel Science Foundation. In addition, Carl has received several research prizes, as well as university and international teaching awards. His research discoveries attract widespread public and media interest, including 60 Minutes, Newsweek, Nova, National Geographic, Discovery, and many others. My esteemed co-host for this evening are my good friends Omar and Zahir. Omar is a Palestinian research assistant at MIT in the area of RNA detection and prognostic devices. He is interested in finding a win-win solution for the conflict that is beneficial for Palestinians and Israelis. Zahir is a Palestinian from the West Bank with a lot of knowledge regarding Palestinian history, folklore, and the origins of Palestinian tribes, clans, and people, and many more things, as you will see when you hear him speak. The history of Israel-Palestine in search of a common narrative. So the topics for this episode are the genetic roots of the Jewish and Palestinian people, looking for a common narrative that fits the data. As I mentioned, there has been over the last 20 years, starting with Ariel Oppenheim in Hadassah Medical School, doing research, originally the Y chromosomal paternal research, showing a relationship between Jews and Near East populations, including Palestinians. That sort of opened the door. And that was followed by sort of autosomal research studies where you look at the full genome of Jewish populations and Palestinian populations. And it also continued to show similar commonalities. And even more recently now, there are studies on looking at ancient DNA. That's where they dig up bones from the ground, and they did something like 70 samples from 70 skeletons found from about 3,000 years ago, showing that the majority of the ancestry of the modern Jewish people and the modern Palestinian people seems to match those bones they find in the ground in the region. And so that's been fascinating. And we, as people who've been involved in sort of peace activism, my co-host and I've long noticed, like, a lot of conversations when you start talking about Israel and Palestine, it starts to get into like who was here first, and starts to get into a discussion amongst novices often, but about genetics and about ancestry and about history. And then sometimes they'll start arguing, well, I was here first. And then I find that when you present them with this information, they're like, well, actually, you both seem to have been here first, and you seem to be related to each other. So now, take that information and figure out what that means to you and where you go forward. Also wanted to have a disclaimer, right? The Israel-Palestinian conflict is a very serious issue, and it requires an ethical political solution to resolve it. A common narrative is not a replacement for a political solution. However, believe that this discussion can help. Finding a common narrative helps create the mindset necessary for us to think together as what that solution might look like and how we might move forward. So that explained, I'm going to mention what I think are the three possible explanations that I use to think about this data. If Jews and Palestinians share some common ancestry, the first option is we're all the descendants of the Canaanites, like it was in the recent study where they looked at skeletons that they identify as Canaanites because they come from the Canaanite period, and that's sort of one narrative, that we're all the ancient Bronze Age Levantines, and there's some support for that. Then the next one is what Tsvi will bring up, is that we're all Hebrews or Israelites, Jews and Samaritans, and the surrounding Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, and all these people from the Bible that have a common Hebrew-speaking root in this land, and we are their descendants. And that's certainly, from the Jewish perspective, very heartwarming way to look at it, and that's very nice. And we'll discuss with our Palestinian co-hosts how they feel about that. And the other one that's often comes up is the Isaac and Ishmael story, the sort of the biblical story of these two brothers that were born in Hebron and went their separate ways, and their descendants formed the what are now the Jewish people and the Arab people. And that narrative resonates a lot, and you hear that in the discussion of discourse. So I say let's unless my co-hosts have any comments, I say let's start with Carl and bring us up to speed on what is the latest, the state of the art for genetic research on Jewish and Palestinian ancestry. What do we know, and where is this information going?
Thank you, Rafi. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Zahir. Thank you for the invitation. And maybe I'll begin with this disclaimer myself. Okay. In other words, I think that I will, because I've been asked to, and out of politeness, try to say what I can about the specific question of genetic affinities and the use of genome sequencing as an adjunctive tool, along with narrative histories, archaeology, archival records, memory, and so forth, in trying to understand shared histories and ancestries. But I will say right up front that much of that is much, much less relevant to me personally than the single way overriding consideration that there are some 12 million plus people here now, between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. And that's just living, breathing men, women, and children. And to me, that eclipses everything else. In other words, I may or may not find an archaeological piece of evidence for this or that Solomonic temple or this or that prior population, non-Jewish, Jewish, Druze, Canaanite, others from 2,000 something years ago or 5,000 years ago. That is interesting. It may have, as you said, Rafi, impact on our current conceptions. It may shape the nature of nuanced discussions about grievances and injustices and events that occurred 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and 1,000 years ago. But overriding all of that is my view that we are human beings. That's our main shared ancestry, our main overwhelming, overriding, eclipses everything else by far, by orders of magnitude. And that's our shared ancestry. That's as clear as can be. And therefore, that is the main issue we need to contend with. Not saying to ignore what I'm about to try to explain very briefly, 20, 25 years of research, but it's to me more of an interest, a curiosity, but should, and as you pointed out correctly, Rafi, it can be helpful, but it cannot replace the active efforts that we should be making because we're living, breathing human beings and have need to respect that the fact that we're here. Some people may think that we should came here too late, too early, shouldn't be here, shouldn't come, whatever. But the fact is, we're here, and Palestinians are here. Israeli Arabs are here. Israeli Arabs who call themselves Palestinians. Jews, whatever Druze, people who are living here are here, and we are not going to be displacing each other. We're not going to be destroying each other. We are going to have to learn to live together. And if certain findings can help that along, make it more comfortable for this person or that person living here or there, then wonderful. I'm in favor of that. But it should not be the basis. And refuting a bit of common ancestry or a bit of evidence of this or that other should not be the undoing of what I view as the overriding reason for us to seek peace and be peace activists. That said, I will anyway, because you've asked. I'll try to very briefly review, because some of the listeners may or may not be familiar with population genetics. And just in a word, we know that of the 7+ billion people living on Earth, we each have 3 billion base pairs, and most of those base pairs are very similar to each other, remarkably similar to each other, so that all humans across the globe have shared recent ancestry. Actually, it's frighteningly recent, and it's a very small cohort of individuals we all come from. We've wandered, we've mated, we've moved, etc. And if we focus in, and that can be studied in many parts of the world, and we have the ability to, in contemporary living individuals, compare the small amount of variation among different populations and reconstruct through that variation patterns of migration, of admixture, of movement from geographic place A to geographic place B, introgression into another population, and so forth. And I won't go into all of that because there are many, many books and well-written and many videos and much, and I think many of the listeners probably are familiar with that. When we now focus in a little bit on the Palestinian people and Jewish people living in Israel and outside of Israel as well, and look at the variation, we can see areas of shared ancestry where there's variation that is closer among descendants of diaspora Jewish communities and contemporary Palestinians than with other populations, just in very general terms. That's not true for every single Jewish diaspora population who have recently being in the last 100 years, resettled or come to the current state of Israel, what was Palestine until the establishment of the state of Israel. Now, you referred, and I think it's extremely, probably the most enlightening bit of genetic work is that which you referred to, the very recent study by Lily Agronet-Tamir, from Liran Carmel, David Reich, Israel Finkelstein. It's a very nice coming together of archaeology with genetics. That's why I like it so much, with history. And as you point out, it was actually 93 samples, DNA from 93 samples, 73 new and 20 pre-existing, which were analyzed and show what really we should have kind of, realized. Of course, we all realize it. There were people here long before there were Jews, there were Arab, Muslim Arabs, Christian Arabs, Druze, Bedouin. There were people here. There were people living here. These people, some, came from Northeast Africa, where all humanity originated and spread around the globe from. Some came back from the, let's say, Caucasus or from the Zagros Mountains through the Caucasus and various areas. They came here, and there were lots of people living in this part of the world. Somehow it was an attractive crossroads. Makes sense if you think about it, of geographic location, the Eastern Mediterranean coast. There were people here, and those people left descendants, and some of those descendants moved to various parts of the world, admixed, and have recently come back. That would be the Jewish establishment of Israel as a state for the Jews, with the establishment of the state of Israel. And there were other introgressions. There were introgressions or movements of Arab nation and Arabic-speaking people from the Arabian Peninsula into this area. There were indigenous, but when you look at the DNA, and this is very, very strong, I think, in this cell paper, that we can see a common shared set of variations which belong to, or which are carried by in a large proportion of the genomic sequence of contemporary Palestinians and Levantine Arab-speaking populations and Jews, even though they've admixed and brought with them from their various thousands of years of wandering through Europe and North Africa and further east in the Middle East, brought with them variation from those parts of the world, but also carry through those millennia bits of that original commonality. And that's what's really evident. And that is perhaps the most important part of the shared genetic narrative. And it's throughout the genome. You're right that the work started with paternal and maternal ancestries, that is the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA, that was easiest to study in 1995, 96. But now the entire genome can be studied, and one can see these shared, so that the Jewish people coming back have this tapestry with these shared threads, and these shared threads among them are also shared with Palestinians. That is kind of a bottom line message. Again, I go back and saying that's very heartwarming, it's nice, it's uplifting, it maybe makes this process of reconciliation easier for some people, but again, for me, the overriding ancestry is that we're all humans living here together. I'll stop there, and I'm willing to, obviously go deeper. I've given it a very, very superficial kind of soundbite approach.
Omar, do you have any questions for Carl?
Yeah, I mean, I can ask a general question. When it comes to studying ancient samples from like the Bronze Age, other than like archaeological evidence of like whether those peoples were of a Phoenician culture, an Israelite culture, or any of the other Levantine groups, is there any genetic piece of evidence that can potentially distinguish these Bronze Age peoples from one another? Because as far as I understand it, they're extremely close genetically.
That's a great question, Omar. Now, I have to say that I'm very inexpert in the study of ancient DNA. So all my work over the years has been contemporary DNA taken from living, breathing individuals today. And the entire field of studying ancient DNA has undergone a revolution and breakthrough because of technological advances of deep sequencing, Svante Pabo, of course, and David Reich and others, whose I can't mention all their names, and shed light. So taking that technology and applying it to what you have pointed out, that is these various sites, and actually, I will try this share screen for a second. This is, if this works, we'll see in a minute. Not sure it'll work. So let's just skip it then, so as not to trouble the listening audience. So I'm off the share screen, I think. And basically we have, sites, of course, from what is currently in Israel, Chatzor. It was also called Chatzor for a long time. I'm sure Tsvi Misinai knows much more about the history, and many of you do. Yehud, areas in Amman, around Jerusalem, areas in Lebanon, Sidon, and others, multiple sites of what were the Canaanite city-states. And the relationship between the genetics and the culture, or the naming of a site, is quite correct, Omar, is inferential, not direct. It's inferred by archaeologists who do carbon dating along with other technologies, look at the nature of the pottery, the nature of the material, then look at the petrous bone or the skeletal remain nearby and say, oh, this must come from there. Draw an inference, and then say this was this following Canaanite city-state, and this was that. And you're quite right, and this was one of the big findings of the Cell paper, was as opposed to what really no one knew or no one was sure about, these Canaanite city-states, the inhabitants thereof, the small number that had been sampled, were quite related to each other. In other words, they were city-states, but they were actually quite related to each other, and not so surprising, there was a population that was mixing and moving in this tiny, small part of the world, relatively speaking. And you're quite right that there were a few pockets of other populations, let's say coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, whether they be Phoenician, Philistine, from Greece, etc., also introducing their DNA. Humans love to move and to mate. And when they move, they bring their DNA. When they mate, they leave their DNA and their descendants. And that's what we can see. And these were people, and then they developed cultures, they adopted religions, they started working together, sometimes they fought, and then, I think we're seeing the bits and fragments of that history being reconstructed, and here we are today, living together.
I do have one more quick question. So when it comes to studying modern populations and trying to understand the commonalities of ancestry between modern populations, one important aspect is how sampling is done generally. So when you study various Jewish groups, either in the diaspora or in Israel, you can get samples from the Ashkenazim, different Sephardic communities, and so on. But like from what I've seen so far, most of the Palestinian samples are just labeled as Palestinian without really much, I guess, background to where exactly they're from. And the way Palestinian society is structured is that we know our paternal line quite well, and it's been a part of various empires throughout history. So there's been an admixture from various areas, but are you aware of any studies that, for example, home in on certain clans or certain regions of like different Palestinian tribes in like, let's say, the north of Akka, versus tribes in like the south of Hebron, and study their differences? Because I think it would be, quite interesting, at least to study the autosomal DNA, or even just the Y chromosome, and just to see if like the folk stories match or not. And I guess that this can, this might be somewhat in Tzvi's area, because he was, trying to see like Jewish cultural connections or practices passed on in certain Falahin communities, because they're a settled people as opposed to other communities in the area. So I guess in terms of like the question, do you see any benefit in, I guess, looking at like microcosms? I guess.
Omar, I think it's, you've hit on a very, very key point. So sampling and the resolution in sampling, just leaving aside now ancient DNA, as you correctly brought us back to contemporary DNA, is not at all kind of symmetric between Jewish populations and the Palestinian population, or even other Middle Eastern populations. So European populations in general, and certainly Ashkenazi Jews and North African Jews and Middle Eastern Jews from Iraq and even India have been much more sampled at a much higher level of resolution and much larger numbers proportionately to the existing population than have, let's say, the Palestinian population. And not only that, but by country, by family name, by maternal, by paternal, the maternal compared to the autosomal, the paternal compared to the autosomal, all of them compared to each other. All of that has been done to a much higher degree of resolution, has been informative, has actually led to an industry as well, okay? So, people are sending their DNA away, paying money, trying to find out who their third cousin once removed is, even though they're not even speaking to their brother for the last 30 years. They still want to know their fourth cousin once removed is somewhere across the globe. But that has been much, you're quite right, more intensely studied. And I think there's certainly a scientific merit and perhaps even a personal, familial merit and there's no reason not to really be able to do that I'll tell you why I'm appreciating this and learning it more these days, because of a new project in Israel called Sifas or Mosaic, that it was very easy to try to define the Jewish population of the state of Israel by what European or North African, Tunisia, Morocco, Lithuania, when 70 years ago, 90 years ago, Ethiopia, etc. When it came to the Arab-speaking population and Palestinians, we had to do, I spoke to a number of experts and to the best I could, to try to reconstruct that. In the Druze population was a little bit easier on the paternal line, but in other Arab-speaking populations and among the Palestinians, it seems to be quite a complex tapestry that I think there's a lot to learn of pure scientific information and pure historical information, just like finding, let's say, an archival record in a particular family, an artifact in a particular family. It goes back. I think it can be, and I think you're absolutely right. And it could be very. So why do I mention Sifas before I let Tsvi Misinai, who seems, I think, to have studied this more in depth. I know he and I met. I hope he remembers, maybe 12 or 15 years ago or more, or at the Rappaport Institute. I don't know if he remembers that meeting. I remember it very well. But the Sifas project is a new Israeli initiative to try to develop what's called the Israel, and I would add Palestine. It's not in there, but I would add it, reference genome. So in other words, the human reference genome, you're familiar, you're at the heart of all this, right? And Rafi also and others, is kind of not that relevant to us. We need to develop what's called a de novo assembly Israel-Palestine reference genome. And CIFAS is starting with Israel. I think if it's successful, I would hope that Palestinians everywhere will also want to join in that. And it means full genome sequencing of tens of thousands and maybe even hundreds of thousands of individuals for health reasons, but also for historical and scientific reasons. And that is taking off even as we speak these days.
Thank you.
That's fascinating. I have many more questions, but I'd like to go on to Tsvi for to give him a chance to start. So Tsvi, what has your research shown in terms of, you know, the anthropological studies that you've done, looking at common Hebrew, common Jewish and Samaritan roots amongst Palestinians that you've written about, the personal stories, the testimonials that people you met, and what does that mean to you?
Okay, first, I agree with Carl that the early history and the shared genome is secondary to what we are trying to achieve today and to the solution that is required here. There's no main argument or serious argument about us being different in the history, but and there are enough findings for this already. I will not get into this now. What's important is what can contribute to a solution here. And the long past or the very far past is less relevant, though for me it was a catalyst to do a study of what we can find today. And I'm working on this already for 20 years. Only recently I've found from 4 different sources that about 1885, the Ottomans prepared a large file of families living here. And these families that they found they found that 100,000 families living here on both sides of the Jordan River had a Jewish history. And they made the elders or the heads of the families to sign this document. This document exists in an archive in Ankara today. And the meaning of this, I calculated the average number of persons in a family at that period to be a bit above 4, which means this is about 400,000 plus people living here that are of a Jewish origin. And the population in 1885 in both sides of the Jordan were a bit above 500,000. So we are speaking around 80% that testified for their Jewish origin. And the meaning of this is that at that time we had a lot of knowledge about the origin of the Palestinians, because at that year most of the people here were considered Muslims or were Muslims. There are more details about what happened a bit earlier in 82, that all these Palestinians were forced to desert their Jewish customs. But the important part is this document that shows that there was a knowledge about it, a very good knowledge for 80% of the Palestinian people there. Now, what happened later is that Haji Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti, that was a clear anti-Zionist, he just hidden this document for the public, and by this he succeeded to get a mob damaging the Jews, killing the Jews, and not that many, but he succeeded to create hatred between the parties. And with this, the hatred started. He started making problems to the Jews in 1920, but the problems became bigger in 1929 in Hebron, in Jerusalem, in other places, and this created hostility. But in 1936, became the Big Arab Riot, and this was much more serious. Ben-Gurion in 36 said that no Jews should give up any piece of the land west of the Jordan River. But after what happened here, the events and the massacres that went here, he deserted this idea, though in 1956 he tried to Judaize the Bedouins in the south. Judaize means not in the religious point of view, but in the national point of view. And Moshe Dayan brought Haredim to do this job, and the Haredim with their clothes, it was too hot for them in the Bedouin tents, so they gave up, and Moshe Dayan lied to Ben-Gurion and told him that the Muslim world will not like what they are doing, and Ben-Gurion gave up. But 1 week before the assassination of Sadat, this was 12 years before the peace between Jordan and Israel, Hussein sent a letter to Sadat telling him, if we really want peace, we must publish the results of that Ottoman document, so people will know that we are actually blood brothers. And Sadat didn't have the time to get to this, and he was murdered, and nothing came out of this. But the important part of my study, as it was wandering across Judea mainly, but also in Samaria, and in the Negev, in the north, and so on, and I found thousands of testimonials from different families, and I've written about it in Hebrew and in Arabic, so people can find about these testimonials. The testimonials are some stories, are Jewish customs that existed among the Palestinians for a long period. Some of them exist still today, but many just were lost over the last 2 generations, but still people remember them today. I can get into details, but this is not the issue now. You can all read it if you, I don't know, Omar, if you still read Arabic. Do you read Arabic?
Yeah, I can read Arabic.
Okay, so I can send you the document later, but in general, the finding show, and we have signs like menorahs, mainly Magen David or the Star of David, and I can get into details, but it's not important now, and many other Jewish customs that show that the Palestinians are originally Jews, and they know about it, and they are happy to hear about it, because the situation now among many of them is horrible. If they can work in Israel, the situation is better, but they have to pay, every worker have to pay about 2,500 shekels to get a permit. That's one kind of corruption that exists here. And those that cannot come and work here are in a horrible situation. From the economic point of view, this is why it is possible to incite the youngsters to become shaheeds and make some terror here and there and kill some Jews. But most of the shaheeds that we heard recently, we know very well about their Jewish ancestry. And we publish this information, they hear about it, they read it, not all of them, and they're excited that finally there can be not only a solution, but a good solution. Because today, with what happens in some Arab countries, especially those that don't have oil, they see the deterioration. On the other hand, they can see how Israel is flourishing in their normal days, not in the time of the corona. So for them, if we offer them to become again part of us, this is, they like it very much. Many do not believe that this is possible. Many do not believe that we'll accept them. Many do not believe that even if we accept them, they will become equal in their abilities. But I know the problem, I studied as well, in the Arab culture that makes all this inferiority for the Arab nations in their countries, which mainly the morality, the Arab desert tribal morality, and the Arab language. Both of them are disasters, and they contribute significantly to the situation in the Arab countries. Of course, those that have oil are not in that problem, but the oil will not last forever. And in this sense, many of those prefer to return to be part of our people. I'm speaking without forcing any religious conversion. Freedom of religion, that is a very important principle in order to be, so for this direction to be accepted. But we are currently blood brothers, and we have to come closer with our culture to each other, and the Palestinians have to learn more about our culture, about our history, about their own history that was hidden from them, in order to be able to unite, and instead of killing each other, we should flourish together here and have the entire region to flourish as well. So this is very important to know. I can tell you a very important leader from the past in Judea, when he read my book in Arabic, he told me, everybody is Jewish. So I told him, not everybody, almost everybody. I know about, in general, about 90%. I can tell you who are the others. And he told me, if you do this, Tsvi, you will become the hero of the Palestinians. He knows the situation there. He doesn't see any hope from any place, only maybe from Iran. But Iran, if they will send the nuclear bomb, it will not spare the Palestinians. So we have to take it seriously in order to resolve this never-ending conflict. And we have to use this direction to bring prosperity and peace to all of us. So Jibril Rajoub, for example, which is more famous, he got my book in Arabic, and even before reading it, just what he saw in video from the TV, he told my friend, my Bedouin friend that is an IDF officer, that, and this is not to make myself proud, but to understand that he understands the importance of this, that I'm an unappreciated national asset. So, and I am appreciated by many people, but they cannot believe that this is done. But I know how to do it because I've studied it for the last 20 years. I invested a lot of my money that I made in high tech in order to found the details. Most of the Palestinians hate the Sultan, the Palestinian Authority, because they know, number one, they exaggerate, they multiply the number of Palestinians in Judea and Samaria. In Gaza, it's more than 3 times the real number. And because of this, the support that they got from the West, half of it they will be able to embezzle. And the people know about it, and they know how poor they are, and these leaders are making fortune, and they hate them. In addition, if some Palestinian is caught by the police, they prefer to be in the hands of the Israeli police and not the Palestinian police, because the Israeli police is more polite, more enlightened, and gives them more right. So the issue in general is they have to make this thing known. And I have many Palestinian friends, many Jewish Arabs, Israeli Arabs, that want this solution. The main problem is the Jews, they can't, number one, it's difficult for them to believe that those that are trying to murder them from time to time are brothers. And even if they believe in this, they don't accept that this can bring peace. But I know from the Palestinian side that this is their best dream. They don't like the Palestinian Authority. They don't want a Palestinian state. A survey that was done by Najaf University about 7 or 8 years ago showed that this was done among 4,000 Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, and it showed that 80% prefer to be part of Israel and not part of a Palestinian Authority. Later, the PA that is funding the university instructed them to get rid of this study and put some fake study that contradicts this. So in general, I think it's important that people will hear the truth. I have many details about it, and it's important that this will be followed in order to resolve the long conflict here, the conflict that doesn't enable any solution.
Thank you, Tsvi. Can we get some questions from our Palestinian friends? I'd like to hear how they respond to this idea.
Sure. So, I mean, there are aspects of what Tsvi said that's very interesting, and certainly, I think kinship or sort of a common origin tale. I think there's a lot to be gained from that. I do think, though, that this desire to sort of create fictive kinship and effectively Hebrewize a people that actually have a fairly strong Arab identity is, in my view, not realistic. I think what's more likely to happen, perhaps, is that you can highlight that, hey, we have a common origin. That's something that people already identify with. So most Palestinians already identify, their Jewish neighbors as being their, cousins, kind of going off the Ismail story. And I know actually some aspects of the origins of the Falastin is quite interesting, because I think there is a significant, Jewish population that converted, to Christianity in the Byzantine Empire, and then to Islam later and whatnot. So there is some credence to that, particularly amongst the Falahi population. But other groups have very old Arab roots, and so it's not universal. I don't know how we can come up with percentages. That's quite difficult to do without sort of a mass, survey or census to really know. But I can certainly say that a lot of the really prominent and really big clans are very proud of their, roots, and they actually come from old cultures or civilizations that come from the regions. So the basic kind of Arab tale or folklore about the origins of these populations is generally that you have the Adnanite Arabs and the Qahtanite Arabs. So the Adnanite, the folklore, so to speak, and how anthropologically accurate this is sort of varies, but it's nevertheless sort of the identity in the tale. The Adnanites are the descendants of Adar, from the Kadarite kingdom. So sort of looking at like the Negev and the Sinai, and and you have the Lambat, the Lambatians. So you have Lambatian Arab tribes, and they're like sort of the Levantine Arabs, and they migrated south and warred and then integrated with the Qahtanis. And the Qahtanis are, from Yemen, and they actually belong to several different groups. And both see, Nabat and Qadar and these tribes see themselves as being descendant of Ishmael, and depending on how religious you are, or whether you sort of see that as symbolic of the migration, or a common ancestry, these two groups migrating towards the Arabian Peninsula, then sort of developing this Arabized culture, or you take it more literally, regardless, this remains fictive kinship. Fictive kinship is very much the way these tribal confederations would form. So they would focus on highlighting a common father. They would appeal to Adnan, their common paternal ancestor, appeal to Ishmael, their common paternal ancestor, without trying to override what were distinct cultures. And so you would have like Banu Hashim, Banu Ghassan, Banu Khalid, these different tribal confederations made up of different Arab tribes and clans. I do think trying to go the opposite direction, Hebrewize, is not likely. Even as far back as the Nabateans, people used Aramaic as like a written language, but Arabic, Proto-Arabic was basically a language that was there at the time. So this goes back fairly far back. So I do think you can get people to embrace, I think simply getting to the point where, both populations see the history of the other as actually part of their own heritage. I think that's more realistic. And I think we did very much used to think this way up till fairly recently. So I do think in Nablus, we have a lot of families descended from Samaritans. Probably just 2 generations ago. So our grandfathers, if you give them the last name of any, Palestinian group, they would have recognized what their origins roughly are. A bunch of prominent Nablus families are known to be Samaritans. A lot of the Fallahin, we know, which villages are quite old, which villages are potentially pre-exile, or, converted during the Byzantines under the Sassanid Empire. So that history is preserved to some extent. It would require a lot of research to really compile percentages and to know people's origins. But also, when people change their culture, they tend to be quite proud of that. I mean, it would be the same as me trying to convince the Jewish people that you're all Canaanites and should go back to Canaanite polytheism, because you were one day until your culture changed and the Israelites emerged. So I think people are also proud of their identity when it does emerge. So I don't know. I don't think trying to assimilate the identity is likely, but certainly creating a common thread or a common narrative that says, well, hey, a very large percentage of your population probably has Jewish ancestry. I think that there's some evidence that could be true, although there's a lot of studies that you need to do to really break down those populations. But even when we talk about prominent Arab clans or tribes, the Tuqans, the Nimmers, the Barghouthis, the Tamimis, they all have a particular history that manifested until fairly recently, right? So until like the 1800s, the late 1800s, and in the Qaisi-Yamani conflict. And so they still sort of recognized, whether they had like Levantine or Yemenite origins, and kind of what their identity was, and when they arrived in the land. And so a lot of them see themselves, for example, as returning. So you could talk about like the Barghouthis, who the story goes arrived about 1,000 years ago from Spain. But they were actually, so that tribe that moved to Spain is one of the Azad, one of them who are supposedly Nabatean in origin. So they kind of saw themselves as returning, just like we, the Ashkenazim, though they spent a lot of time in the diaspora, returned to the land. So not only do you have a history here, but also you are returning to this place from where you see your identity emerging. I think that's probably a better way forwards. And then beyond that, like I take your points about, yes, the PA is not popular in Palestine, in the West Bank in Palestinian society, but certainly neither is the Israeli state. So I agree. People look at the comparative economic differences, but I would say that there is more people have a sense that they've suffered far more at the hands of the Israeli state than the PA. Indeed, part of why we dislike the PA is we see it as part of a larger Israeli, security apparatus. And so, and that moves us a bit further away from kind of the core conversation. But I don't think it's that simple. Like, I don't think it's, the political problems can be reduced down to just, we need to create this like fictive kinship. And then, very quickly, everyone will kind of feel united, because, you can look at other Arab states, or even forget Arab states. You could look at us before, the new Yishuv, before the first Aliyah, and our own tribes warred with each other. So it's not like just because you can convince people that they're related, that suddenly, that resolves all of your political feuds. There's plenty of Arab states with civil wars. So it's not just about language or identity. It's all. There is also a separate political element, but I think there is something to this. I certainly think that when you look at the way heritage sites are treated, and the response that both groups seem to have to the presence of the other history, I think that's something here that would be quite interesting. So either the history of the pre-48 villages and the attempt to kind of pretend that they never existed, or pretending the Jewish history never existed in the land. Like, I think that definitely is an area where recognizing that the history of the other group is also your own. I mean, it's just the history of the land. And if you're from here, if this is your land, then this history should matter to you, on both sides. So that would probably be, my overall response to some of the stuff that Tsvi said. I don't know if you want to elaborate, Tsvi, on what you think about. So for example, the Falahin are particularly interesting to me. And I think that would probably be the largest population that maybe could fit into the narrative that you have in mind, Tsvi, of like conversions over time under different empires. But I'm curious as to how you came up with your percentages and your, notions of like what percentage of the population this makes up, and why you think sort of people would be willing to assimilate, or rather, why wouldn't go the opposite direction? I mean, why wouldn't we call you Mustarab, Arabized? All the Mizrahis are Arabized. Or why it can't really sort of go both ways? Yeah.
Can I, since I have,
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your response as well, Carl.
I have to sign off in a little while. I just wanted to express my appreciation for what Zahir was just explaining. First of all, it reconciles nicely with what Omar was asking earlier about the complexity of the Arab nation, Arabic-speaking people in the Levant is as we just heard, very intricate and can't just be simplified, and hasn't been well studied at the genetic level, in alignment with the even brief but already intricate rendition and discussion that Zahir gave us. It would be very valuable, and I think truth can sometimes be painful, but truth is also what moves us forward. In genetics, it's hard to you can bring all kinds of stories and things, but your genes are there if you do them right and don't fabricate the results. They're there, and indeed, the little bit of information there is does indeed show, I think what Zahir has said, that there is huge complexity and a lot of many population isolates, which are descendants of tribes which have moved from here and there, and therefore it is very complex. And there has been, a long-standing Arab nation that has moved and come and gone, and many migrations, and therefore, I think it's important not to oversimplify the situation. And I think the main message is what the beginning message that we all kind of agree on, but also the message that we just heard of the affinity, some past affinity of a common origin, a love for the land, and then a coming together without oversimplifying, without creating one big narrative versus another. But there are many complexities, just like we see in the composition of the Jewish population currently residing in the state of Israel. It's complex. They've had a very complex history, perhaps over a broader geographic region worldwide, and similarly for the Arab-speaking peoples of the Levant, complex history, perhaps over a slightly narrower, although we heard now from Zahir about coming all the way from Spain, which is quite far. So I think it's not. I think it will advance us more to not oversimplify, but to appreciate the beauty of the tapestry. Actually, I want to say one more word about genetics, and I think it's something that's sometimes overlooked a little bit, and that is the phenotype, the way people speak and look, and obviously a population that may have had and did have by history and by DNA sequence, let's say, a Levant origin, but then resided outside and introgress and admix for many, many generations in Europe, have picked up phenotypes and a look and phenotype being the way we appear and behave and speak, which has meant as European or more Eastern, Middle Eastern or North African affinities. And that happens very quickly. And so that, and a population which has been in the region, even though it's complex, but in a more tightly geographic region, will not have that larger spectrum of phenotypes. And therefore, sometimes that can make people who are actually closely related seem distant. They seem distant. Oh, you don't look like me, you don't talk like me. Well, obviously not, because we've been wandering around further geographic areas. And that can be uncovered. That's one of the strengths of genetics. Again, I want to just go back right to my opening statement. I think genetics is like an adjunctive tool. It can be of interest, but it does not replace what Tsvi Misinai said. I think what we all agree on, the overwhelming shared ancestry we have as humans living here today, however we got here, and the complexity of our cultures and so forth. And I think replacement is not, is not a way to just everything. I think everyone agrees with that. It's not a way forward.
Yeah,
I would like, if possible, to answer to Zahir. You mentioned several names of tribes and families.
Very polite if I at some point I will fade out at some point. I apologize for that. I didn't. Okay, so you will see me again. It's not because of lack of interest or lack of importance or anything, and I'm happy to come back at some point. But at some point, I will be polite.
That's totally understandable. Yeah.
Thank you.
But thank you so much for coming. We don't get to chat again before you go. Okay, Tsvi, take it away.
Zahir, you mentioned several tribes and families. I didn't pick or remember all of them, and some I don't know anything about them, but many I know. Let me tell you first about a more famous person, Barghouti. I know from their village about their family there. It's a village called today Kubar. And I know that they're of a Jewish origin. He knows it himself. My book in Arabic arrived to him in prison through Jibril Rajoub. I didn't get any reaction yet. But I know from his family and from other families in the village about them. Now, the name Kubar of their village is not the original name. The original name was Kufar, because they stayed Jewish while everybody around became Muslim already. So they called them Kufar, but later they changed it to Gubar. So Kufar means the infidel, which the name that was given to the Jews. Now, if we speak about Bani Hassan in Jordan, they came there from around the Yemen, from Hassan Mavet, and this was from a famous Jewish tribe there. And I have a picture from 1921 approximately that shows one of them that came to bless the English controller here, that Herbert Samuel, that he had a peot, he had his head, from his head he has the hairs of a Jewish that were partially
Sidewalks, call them.
Yeah. So,
and this, but about Tamimi, the nature of the name Tamimi means in Hebrew innocent, but in Arabic it is not liquid, it's solid. What does it mean? It's not the original name. I will get to the original name. It means that they are not fluid or moving from one religion to another. This is Tamimi. They were forced by the Ottoman to stop using their Jewish customs. This was in about 1882. And the Tamimi today is a staff. The original family, the main family is Tamim el-Dari. That was a Jewish friend of Muhammad, and he had wine. He was going wine in Mecca, and Muhammad told him, you cannot continue growing wine here. You know the reason in Islam. So he promised him to get, this was before Hebron, Khalil was conquered by the Arabs, and he promised, that happened after his death, he promised him to get some 5 points in Hebron, and he told him, start moving your wine to there, make yourself Muslim, and go there. And this is the main family, Tamim el-Dari, of Tamimi, which means the solid or innocent of my home, in Arabic. Now, and it was a very good friend. Around Tamim el-Dari, several other families joined, and all of them called themselves Tamimi, which is a list of families that is very large in Hebron. It went, part of them went to other places, but these are all of a Jewish origin. So, and I have more and more, there's no point of going into this. Now, about who should be, if the Jews should, here in the country, I'm not saying Jews everywhere or so on, should become Arabized, or the Palestinians will become Hebrewed, some Hebrews. The issue is like this. As I said before, the Arab language, I will not get into details now, is a disaster. This what causes many problems in the Arab world. There's no time to get into details. I've written everything about it in Hebrew. But also, I mentioned it as well, the Arab morality, the tribal desert Arab morality that developed, and I'm not blaming anybody, everybody is good, but the conditions of life in the desert were horrible and were all around water. And this created a morality which is not good today and is responsible to what happens in several Arab countries today. It doesn't exist as much in Egypt, but everywhere else it exists, and it's a problem, especially in the Middle East, less in Morocco and Algeria. So just it is important for the Palestinians to go back to their origin. We, the Jews, we never were Arabs. So there's no origin to get back into. And actually, the Palestinians were Jews that were forced to become Muslim, and they adopted the Arab language. But for their sake, it's important for them to get acquainted, very good, to read and write the Hebrew language. And many of them know it already from working here or being prisoners and so on. But we have to make it more serious, give them the ability to read and write that many do not have, in order to succeed here together with us and to become solid in our common identity. So to you, it looks that it's impossible, Zahir, because you have been fed with many lies of the Palestinian Authority. And before this said, let me just tell you that the entire idea of the Palestinian people came from the KGB. Actually, it was a journalist of Pravda. His name was Yevgeny Primakov, that was later the prime minister of Russia for 1 year. He educated Arafat of how to first declare or create a people, a fake people that never existed before, and make them suffer and get the support of the world for their cause. And I'm not telling that you should get the support for the misery created by their own leaders in Arab states, but he educated Arafat how to use it in order to destroy Israel. Then before 82 in Lebanon, one of our activists from a ex-Jewish family in Samaria that knows very well the history and was a very good partner to my work, he was in Beirut, and he heard Arafat saying, if I get 2 meters by 2 meters west of the Jordan River, I will destroy Israel. Now, what happened in the Second Intifada, Sharon succeeded to make Arafat irrelevant. And by this, he didn't need to continue with the direction of the two states. Bush sent General Zinni to speak with Arafat, and he said about him that he is the capo of tutti capi, which means the head of the heads of the mafia. And this was good for Sharon because he didn't need to do anything in order to continue with this disaster to the two sides, not just for the Jews. And though Sharon didn't care that much about the other side, he knew a lot. I heard what he knew about people. Sharon said that Hebron, Khalil, is more Jewish than Kiryat Arba. That's what Sharon said. In any case, what happened there is that the KGB, or the continuation of the KGB, sent plutonium to Abu Mazen. Abu Mazen made its PhD in Moscow, and it concluded his work that in the Holocaust there were only 1 million Jewish victims. In any case, they sent plutonium to him, and he took together with 3 partners. They told the servants of Arafat to put a bit of plutonium in his clothes every morning, and that's the way that he was poisoned and killed, in order to force Sharon to continue the negotiations in the direction of two states. And this was all the direction of the KGB in order to undermine Israel, that was an ally of the states, in order to undermine the influence of the states in this region. So you have to understand, you don't have the background of what happens here, though you learned a lot from truth and lies that was given here. Many families and tribes that came here just say that they are Arabs, but they knew that they are of a Jewish origin. And I will be pleased to send you my book in Arabic, so you can read a lot of the details.
Oh, sounds cool.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot there. I think I actually read one of your books. So there's some of the stuff that's there that's interesting, but I think you're kind of painting a bigger narrative onto some points than that there is. So, for example, and perhaps part of that is missing information about Arab tribes and history, totally separate to the conflict here. So, like, even Beni, you brought up, the Tamimis, but Beni Tamim is a larger tribal confederation. It wasn't just one family. So it was many different tribes who were part of this, alliance of different Hamulas under under Beni Tamim. And so there were many different families with many different origins under the tribal confederation. And that's actually quite similar in the region. As for and this kind of comes to a broader point about the differences in morality or societal structure or language, they're actually remarkably similar. I mean, the old Israelite kingdoms were effectively a tribal confederation. I mean, this structure is actually very much, we in a lot of ways, the culture is actually quite similar. Old Israelite or Jewish culture is actually quite similar to to what you're seeing here with these families and these tribes. As far as trying to convince people of an origin that they don't identify with, I mean, you kind of can't do that. Now, I think there's tremendous overlap. So, and yeah, there are stories of families that come in that will adopt an Arab identity, even though they had different ethnic origin. That is part of the case. However, a lot of this stuff predates. So this isn't, PA lies or all this stuff sort of predates even the Arab-Israeli conflict or in the Ottomans. So this shows up in our politics, in the 1800s, the 1700s, and for the last 500, 600 years, like the politics between the Husseinis and the Shashibiyya, and the Zaydanis and the Jarrars, the Tuqans, the Nimmers. Most of the country was split into sort of, allegiances to different cities. And so you have different sheikhs who would war over control over these different, city-states, so Jenin, Nablus, different qadas in the, so, you have a sheikh in the center of like a particular town, and he would rule over a particular area. So and these people will have different identities. So in the case of the Barghouthis, their story is basically that they are from, we say Batun, so a section of, Beni Zaid, which is of Beni Haram, which is a Qahtani, a Qahtanite, Arab tribe. That is their story. And they were at some point in Spain about 1,000 years ago, returned to the land, and then I think ended up actually joining the Qaisi tribal confederation. So this sort of stuff shows up in sort of the documents and kind of the feuds and the wars between these different families, totally separate to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, again, I know that there's lots of stuff that you talk about that is interesting, that there's some evidence for. So I think, there's the tefillin in a lot of the old Fallahi quras and the way the maqams work, the old shrines and stuff. There's a lot of remnants of Jewish culture inside, Palestinian villages and Palestinian people. And yeah, I think there's a decent percentage of the population that are converts, but even sort of the independence of religion from tribal identity is relevant here. So take the example of the Azads. So the Azads were Arab polytheists, Azad tribe, the Azad tribal confederation. That's not specifically Palestinian. That's just a much larger tribe. So they were, Arab polytheists originally. Some of them would have been converted to Judaism, in the land. Then they converted from Judaism to Christianity under the Byzantines. And then when they converted from Christianity, they converted to Islam under the Mamluks, and under the Ottoman era, a lot of the Samaritans converted to Islam to prevent, to avoid persecution and paying jizya and stuff. So conversions happened all the time. Tribal identity and paternal lineage stayed intact. So in any case, most Palestinian Adnanite clans, Azadi clans, see themselves as descendants of Ishmael rather than descendants of Jacob. The 12, all the 12 tribes of Israel. They see themselves as descendant of the sons of Ismail, and that has been part of their folklore, regardless of their religion. And some of them were Jewish at different points in history. There were many Jewish Arab tribes in the Arab Peninsula. Some of them may be descendants of, pre-exile Jews. We know for a fact, very recently, not very long ago, a lot of the families in Nablus are descended from Samaritans. So this history varies, and the other thing is the endogamous nature of these tribes varies as they shift religions. So, one of the Jewish tribes in Arabia converted to Islam, and they would intermarry with the local Arab tribes, and so you have some Jewish ancestry that comes in through that. And that's very recent. So this happened multiple times through the history. The history of the region is very complicated, but people's tribal identity, and it varies from person to person. So I'm sure you've spoken to some people who have this. This tale and this identity, and still actually have a Jewish identity in their tribal lineage, but the tribes that don't, they just have a different story. So you kind of can't force people to adopt a narrative that is different to the one that they have, because that is just who they are. Any more than I can convince a Mizrahi that actually he's not a descendant of Jacob, but he's actually a descendant of an Arab tribe who converted to Judaism. Now you have your identity, you have your sort of family history, then there's some evidence that that history is there. And I think in the case of Palestinians, you are right in that the nationalism is very new, right? But then that nationalism is new because the need for that nationalism is new. So in a lot of ways, people see Palestinian nationalism as or the Palestinian people as bringing together many different origins and identities in the land against what was seen as a European political movement, a European, mindedness of how to basically set up, the structures and the infrastructure of the land. So I don't think it's so much Arab morality or the tribal or the desert culture that we don't have in common, because I think we actually have that in common. All Jewish tribes have a lot of the same identity that we have today. That's certainly what I see when I look at the history. So I think we actually have it's sort of the opposite. I think with the time spent in the diaspora, a lot of the immigrants in the first Aliyah and the second Aliyah brought back with them European notions of how to run a society and how to build a country, and they found themselves at odds with the people who were there. I'm more comfortable listening to biblical Hebrew, or the Hebrew of Yemenite Hebrew speakers who still pronounce the ha and the ra, and the like makol the ayin, than modern Israelite Israeli Hebrew, with the more Yiddish German sounding influences. So even language evolves, identity evolves, and defines a people. I do think, though, that you are better off. The thing that people have, even people's willingness to adopt a different government or a different state to make their lives better economically, I think their paternal lineage is something people are very proud of, and their story, and in some cases is fairly well documented. So the Zaydanis came here with Salah ad-Din. They came here 700 years ago. That's the story that the Zaydanis have, and there's we can kind of get into the debate of every single family, but the Zaydanis claim to be descendant of I believe it's Hassan ibn Ali.
That's right, but that's Salah ad-Din.
So you can take each of these stories, and we can look at which ones are inaccurate, and also obviously there was adoption of name. So you also would have people that would take on the Tamimi name, even though, because Tamimi was a tribal confederation, even though they weren't Tamimi in origin. Hebron is a very good example, actually, because there's a deep Jewish history in Hebron, and so there's a lot of people who would have Jewish origins that would then bury that, and particularly after the conflict. So I think there's some truth to what you're saying. I just think you're kind of trying to paint a larger picture where it applies to every single person. And I just don't think that's true any more than I can say that all of Israelis are actually Mizrahi, or you kind of can't put an identity on someone that they don't have. I mean, there's just the origins are more complicated. The culture people picked up along the way is complicated. And the other thing about Aruba is like when that conversion occurs, you're proud of it. People hold on to that identity. They're not necessarily willing to go back. Some people might be interested in finding about their history past a certain point. But other people aren't. Other people are proud of if you're a religious Muslim, you're proud of converting. You go, yes, we used to be Jewish, and a fundamental belief in Islam. Muslims believe that it's the updated, it's like a continuation of the same message. So you can't convince someone who believes that they've gone the wrong direction. That they were forced to take on a culture that isn't their own. They just see that as naturally, organically changing. And even the history of the Israelite tribes is effectively the evolution of a Canaanite culture becoming the Israelite culture. We can kind of break that down, but that's sort of an anthropological way to think about it. Is you have a people emerging out of a Bronze Age Levantine population, and then developing a new identity, being united by a common belief, a common religious belief in monotheism, and that then bringing those people together. So that's That's sort of my overall take on it. There's a lot of stuff that you talk about that's quite interesting. I do think a common identity is important. I just don't think it's going to work through assimilation. I think it's going to work by letting people take these deep-rooted identities. And in the cases of the people you've spoken about, Tsvi, where they actually know this historical connection that their family might have to Jewish culture, Jewish history, then I think that's great. And they can reconnect with that identity. But in the cases where they don't, they're not going to. Instead, what you do have in common is common connection to the land, a common sense of this being your homeland and this being, the place that you have in history. And hopefully based on that, people can, develop a system of equality rather than sort of the 100 years of Sarah that we've lived under, basically an unequal, unjust system. And that's sort of delving into more politics than I'd like for this conversation. But
Sure.
yeah, that's my take on things.
Is it possible to make a short answer or reaction?
Yeah,
Please.
sure.
Okay. First, if you speak about Tamimi being spread in other places, I have Tamimis from Saudi Arabia, that are in contact with me and telling me that they know about their Jewish origin. There were many Jews there in Hijaz, and some of them became Muslims, or many of them, and others were forced to go to Yemen. And there are still many Arabs, so-called Arabs in Saudi that has this kind of period. How did you say it in English?
The side locks.
Side
Side locks, like a lock,
side lock.
and then on the side.
Okay, they have side locks that they put behind the ear in order to hide it. And the royal family of Saudi, the head of it was a Jew from Iraq. In Kuwait, the ruling family, Kuwaiti, is Jewish. We heard from one of the princes. In the Emirates, the MBZ is, and this family is a Jewish origin. In Dubai, only in the Emirate of Dubai, most of the citizens are of a Jewish origin. Many know about it, others do not know. And in Bahrain, the ruling family is of a Jewish origin. And also in Qatar, the population is of a Jewish origin. We know about many of them. In Yemen, if you take Bani Hassan, for example, they came from Yemen. And in Yemen, there was in the past a very big Jewish kingdom that was called Khibar. This is the second Khibar. I will not get into this now. And many of them came to many places. And if you take Barghouti, they came, I don't know from where they came, but we know very well on their Jewish origin. If you mentioned some other families, I don't remember now, Zaydani, for example. They came from Yemen. They had not only a Jewish origin from there, but they had the Jews to recreate the Jewish settlement in Tiberia. And they built houses for the Jews in Haifa and Akko. And I just recently spoke with this family. And you mentioned other families, I don't know, but we know about many of them. You can read it. In the book, the Zaydani is now in process of translation now for a new version, but I will send you the version that I have. Many families are there. Now, when they became Arabized and they want to succeed, they say that they're Arabs, and many of them invented fake history about the origin of the family. For example, Bashiti from Jerusalem say that they're from Abdel Muttalib. Husseini say that they are from Hussein bin Ali, and but this is entirely wrong. They said it in order to become Effendi and to become tax collector, and the Ottoman authorities believed them and gave them, and this is how they became rich and so on. But Husseini had another name, Al-Aswad. They came from Sudan. They are of a Jewish origin. they lived in a village near Jerusalem, but they married locals in order to change the color of the hair, of their skin. So we know about many, you can read it, and you have to understand that people that wanted to get better life under the Arab and mainly later the Ottoman authorities lied a lot about their origin. There are many cases like this. So, and of course, after 1453, there was here a set of problems in the country, and many moved to other countries, mainly to Saudi, but also to Egypt, Sudan, Iran, and Iraq. And later they returned. And when they returned, they called themselves, for example, Hijazi. That was not the original name. El Masri are Jews that came to the Gaza Strip from Egypt, and because of the promise there for the Jews, and they became like the others, forced to be Muslim. Now, I'm not speaking in any way about any religious conversion. I'm only speaking about national unity. Everybody can have their own religion, and I'm not speaking about forcing anything. Only those that want to rejoin us will select to do this, and you will surprise. It will not happen in one day, but you will surprise the extent of supporters. That's all.
Okay. I mean, I think in terms of a solution, like everyone I know in this room, I know personally, and all of us are in favor of some kind of one state anyways. I think in terms of the narrative, I mean, I don't speak for Carl, I don't know, but the rest of us I know pretty well. And in terms of what I think about the narrative, I think simultaneously it is good for Palestinians especially those who have knowledge of having Jewish roots, to rediscover Jewish roots in a way, like you say, and not in terms of changing their religion or anything, and sort of, just cultural affinity. I'd like to see Palestinians recognize Jewish history and not sort of skip over it and start with the Philistines and then move straight to the Romans as if Jewish history isn't here, and recognize that as part of their history, even though they may have a different identity. And at the same time, I think Jews need to have respect for Arab identity and understand that there were, at least in the south of the country, there were the Nabateans, the Kedarites, there were the Edomians, and there were, even in the classical Jewish period, there were Arabic peoples. Esarhaddon, the son of Sancherib, moved Nabateans into Samaria, even in the period of the northern kingdom as they were being taken over by the Assyrians. So we have a long history of being related, and they have this common story. We have this belief of Isaac and Ishmael. So for those Palestinians who that is their narrative, I think I'm okay with that. Like I accept that they want to be they're still family,
Yeah, I think it's also, there's a difference here about how the two identities work. So I think with the Jewish identity, there's a sense that it's like a light that's going to continue through despite many different conversions and many different cultural changes, that because you have this, old, root, that it's kind of still with you. And so that to some extent makes sense. I mean, it becomes a matter of perspective. So in the case of, let's say, we spoke about the Ghazaidanis or the Tamimis or whatever. So there were many Jewish tribes in Arabia. There's Banu Harith, Banu Ghassan, had the Jaffnas, Banu Aus, Banu Nadir, Banu Qurayza, these are all Jewish tribes in Arabia. So this is definitely there. And so it's entirely possible. So take the example of Zaydanis, who are seen as being, Qahtanites, as are the Barghouthis. Now that just says that they're from Yemen. Now, being from Yemen means, they could have been Jews from Yemen, or they could have been Arabs from Yemen. I can't say for sure. But the way the Arab identity works is almost the opposite, in the sense that it's inclusive. So it's not, so it's meta ethnicity. So as long as you kind of speak the language and you understand the culture, then you're included in the identity. You're effectively Arabized. So it's like not mutually exclusive with the Jewish one. They kind of work differently. So you can kind of be both at the same time. As far as languages, I think it would be good for both people to speak both languages. It's just sort of the region. But you also have to bring it into modern times. So this is also focusing on a long history. But the reality is, part of it also becomes down to how identities are forged, and identities are also partially forged by conflict. So in post sort of in the last 70 to 80 years, the Palestinian identity has been kind of, there's a sense that it's forged together by common suffering or a common struggle. So from the Nakba and the Naksa and sort of the life in the West Bank and Gaza, there's a sense of common suffering, and so there is a resentment for the other group of people. So even those who do have Jewish roots or Jewish origins will tend to feel presently, this doesn't go for everyone, but have more allegiance to this sort of notion of the Palestinian identity, because that represents what they've suffered, in the last 70 to 80 years, better than, I guess, associating with the state of Israel, which for a lot of people, even those who may have Jewish roots, like what Tsvi says, feel that they have suffered at the hands of. So there is no desire to embrace the other state after all that they've been through so far, even if they are, brothers fight and brothers kill each other. And so it's not just about finding common ancestry or common ethnic or tribal origin, but it's also about addressing the most important part of the narrative. When the first Aliyah happened or the second Aliyah happened, it's not like what happened was you had a group of people show up who said, "Hey, we're all related, and let's kind of build this state together." Although I know Ben Gurion made an attempt in his early history very briefly. There was a conflict, and there was an occupation of the West Bank, and so as a result of the conflict, the narrative the average person cares about more is the more recent narrative, the present conflict. So that's the first thing that you need to address. And referring back to common history and common tribal roots, I think helps simplify the conflict from being about we're just fundamentally ethnically different, because I really don't think that that's true. I think there's a mix, and I think there's basically most people are Levantine in origin, but also looking at the political ideology and the conflict the two people have been through. There's a need for reconciliation in that narrative. So you can't just look at the past and go back to thousands of years ago and go, okay, well, we're descendant from a similar group of fathers or some group of people. People already kind of accept that. They're still willing to have a conflict. People who already identify as the same still go to war. Brothers go to war, have throughout history. So it's not enough. There is also this thing that we've lived through for the last 100 years, that's the prevailing narrative of both people, really, the average Israeli and the average Palestinian. So, I think people will take with a grain of salt some of the stuff about the common identity. It is very interesting, particularly in cases where it's well founded. Is that we do have a lot of common roots, whether they're Jewish, Samaritan, or Nabatean or Qadarite. There's a lot of history in this land. It's very, very, very much intertwined. But I don't think that's going to be quite enough, because the new narrative, the narrative of the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in the sense of a common struggle or common suffering, not just Palestinian nationalism, but also most of these people were farmers, so they lived on their village. They didn't really care whether it was the Ottomans or the Byzantines or the Assyrians who ruled over them. What they wanted was to continue to live on their land. That was the most important thing to them. And so being expelled from that land is deeply painful. There's a deep, deep, deep love for the land. I think the deep love for the land is probably the strongest thing you can appeal to on both sides.
Very true.
Is it possible to make a short comment? Zair?
Please do.
Okay.
Yes, but I'll leave it at that after.
Identify with all the suffering. There's no question. It is a big trouble that happened to many of these people. However, the main question is who is responsible for this suffering. The war of 48 started when Haj Amin al-Husseini, that he was in Egypt together with Al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. They incited the people in Egypt to press the king to go to the war. Now, the Egyptian officers told the king, we cannot win against the Jews, but he was forced to start the war, and other Arab countries followed him. And this created the disaster of the Nakba. Now, it's not all. When there was the so-called massacre in Deir Yassin, that was an invention, and I can get in details, but it's not important now. The Syrian and Lebanese prime ministers called the Palestinians to leave the country, and after the Jews will be sent to the sea, then they will get not only back their houses, but also the houses of the Jews. Even the king of Jordan, Abdallah, told the Palestinians, don't, you can stay where you are because we are going to conquer the place and we will save you. So people believed that it's better for them to run away. But this was a major disaster. After the war, the refugees in Cairo attacked, first blamed Haji Amin al-Husseini in the Nakba, and there have been 2 attempts on his life that failed. So, of course, there are victims. There's no question. But the question is, who is to blame? And all the lies that the people were fed about are that we are to be blamed. But we didn't start this war. And of course, we have made some trouble, like Ben-Gurion said to Rabin to make the massacre in Libya, in Lod, in order for the people to run away. Because initially there was no intention to ethnic cleansing, but because the Arab leaders encouraged the Palestinians to leave, many left. Then Ben-Gurion fell in love with this direction, and he told Rabin to massacre 80 people in a mosque in Lod, that caused half of the Palestinians from Lod and Ramle to flee away, part of them to Samaria and other part to Jordan. So there's no question of the suffering, and we have to deal with this. This is the reason for the hatred, but people have to know the truth, who caused this and why the war started. Why? And this was just the first war. Then because the Arab lost in this war, they wanted to rectify the situation. So there was another war and another war until the Arabs gave up and left it to the Palestinians. And the Palestinians were funded by the Arabs and the Soviet Union in order to create terror and create hatred among the Jews to the Palestinians. So there is a lot to rectify, there's no question. But we'll see who will want to join us and who will want to stay Arab. And it will not happen in one day. I am speaking about a long process that will start with those that are part of us already, like some Bedouins, and those families, like in Hebron and other places, they know their Jewish origin, the Samaritan. I'm not speaking about, there's no Jewish people. There's the people of Israel. And the Samaritans, most of them are from 2 tribes of Israel. For example, Bani Sachar are from the tribe of Issachar. They're in Jordan, 70,000. And there are many others in Jordan. Hawitat, for example, in Jordan, the previous commander of the Jordanian Air Force came from Hawitat, and his father had philatelites. And when somebody from there came to visit and found us, and he came back to Jordan, his mother raised her hand to the sky, to God, and told them, finally they found us. You have to understand that this is a major tragedy happening here to both sides. And unless people will understand and know the truth and not the lies that they themselves invented in order to gain some money from tax collecting and so on, we have to remove these lies, and it will be gradual. I'm speaking about a process of 40 years, because we cannot educate everybody at once. Those that favor it now will get it first, and later more and more will join.
Very interesting. Any final thoughts, Omar Zahir?
I don't. I mean, there's too much there that I. While I enjoy the sentiment, there's just too much there I disagree with
Yeah.
to start. I think there is a few things here that are interesting. I do think people recognizing common origins or ancestry or history is important. I think this goes back as far as I'll tell you the Palestinian narrative, as far as who we see to blame for the problem. It's not really it's not really an Arab Jewish thing. So if you go back to 1914, in like Palestine newspaper, in the writings of Asad Asa, what he wrote about, what his thoughts were about the Zionist movement, which he saw as a political party. A political party, and he responded to them as such, and he eventually had to go to an Ottoman court to respond to that. And he said, when we said Zionists, we referred to the political organization with its headquarters in Europe, which aims for the colonization of Palestine, the usurpation of its lands, and its transformation into a Jewish homeland. That was the perception of the Palestinian people in the early 1900s, before even 1917, about what this movement was. And that altered the perception of the locals towards the immigrants, the first Aliyah, and it would later lead to incitement and the beginning of riots and things like the Hebron massacre. So this early ideological split, and I should point out, Asa went on to explain that when he said Zionists, he was not referring to Jews who he saw as his brothers, nor did he have an issue with Jewish immigration per se. Well, the issue lied at the core of political Zionism. Quite frankly, that basically the Palestinians did not buy into the Herzlian, kind of Darjud which we saw as basically being like European ethno-nationalism, and that's the Palestinian, or the modern day Palestinian perspective on the subject matter, telling different Palestinian tribes that they are Jewish in origin, even if they agree with you, still won't change their identity. Okay, great. Okay, I'm Palestinian of Jewish origin. So I'm from in this land, and they will still identify with the
Right.
Palestinian state, because basically, not even just the Palestinian state, but the Palestinian identity, because that's the identity that represents the suffering that this group of people has gone through. Ultimately, they're from a village that was destroyed. I think like we're trying to reduce the Nakba down to like 80 people who died. Is just people just aren't going to buy it. There's somewhere between like 400 to 600 villages that were destroyed in 48. There's villages, people, have a deep identity around. Many were ransacked. Many were killed. Ultimately, you can say there was no intention to ethnically cleanse, but there was plenty of politicians that said that was their intention. That meets the criteria for me. And as far as Arab leaders, we aren't a fan of them either. There is no love. We constantly complain about Al-Hakam al-Arab. We constantly say Arab leaders. Arab leaders are not popular with the people. We are the ones who critique them the most. So I think pointing to them reduces the blame. But Israeli or Zionist political leaders are even less popular. And so, the fact that we're not popular, we're not fans of one, doesn't mean we're fans of the other. And I think that's something that's frustrating for us to see, where it's like, yes, we have so many issues with the PA, we have so many issues with our leadership. We are not fans. They are very corrupt. They have many, many, many problems. But we think the Israeli government is worse, not in terms of how it functions economically or politically, or in terms of organizationally, but in terms of the way they've treated us. And what we've lived through, and that is the thing you actually have to fix, to change people's perception. You can't go the other way. People are not going to embrace the identity of who they see as their oppressor. It's going to go the other way around. I think you need equality and peace first, in order for people to look at their history and see the other side as their kin. You kind of can't convince someone. It's too, you have the Uncle Toms in every society. You have maybe 10-20% of the population is willing to do it for financial gain or to make their lives better. But in the meantime, I do think that identity is not going to shift until you can build it on a backbone of just equal civil and political rights. Until that happens, I don't think that that's going to occur. And I think Palestinian nationalism, whether you interpret that as a state or just the music, poetry, writing of Darwish and Kanfani and all of our sort of traditions and culture and how important the Qadiyya is to every Palestinian is quite deep. And yes, we have people in our population who would be willing to go over the other side. We just see those people as traitors. We see those people as giving up their principles in exchange for financial or monetary gain, or for their lives to be temporarily better. I think probably the key difference that we'll disagree on is just how much, I think, because we've lived through this, like we've seen it with our own eyes, the dislike that Palestinians have for the Israeli state and Israeli history isn't something they were taught in school. Yes, there's problems with the education system. People aren't taught, everything about the history, but it's also stuff we've lived through our own eyes. It's just stuff we've experienced interacting with soldiers or interacting with the other side that leaves us with this impression. And so that you can teach someone about their tribal history or their identity or their origins, but that won't change the fact that the state, the government that they have a distaste for, is that of frankly, they don't like either, but there's no comparison. I mean, most of their suffering has been at the hands of the sense of this big, powerful other. And so that is the narrative. And even if you don't agree with what I've said, Tsvi, I think that's what most people think right now. I'm giving you the word, but what the average Palestinian thinks is the number one, in terms of their identity and their narrative, the number one cause of their problems is this, the Israeli state. Followed by all the problems with our own leadership and our own corruption and mistakes of other Arab leaders. We certainly don't see, the 48 war or the 67 war as having been for our interests, the Palestinian people. It was for the interests of different Arab leaders. And Hakam al-Arab, the Arab leaders are constantly criticized by us, but it doesn't let Zionist leaders or Israeli politicians off the hook for the stuff that they've done. And more recently, the new generation, the kids, the youth, what we've grown up with isn't stuff that our parents taught us or we learned from schools. It's also stuff we've seen with our own eyes. We get our houses raided. We have these interactions. We cop beating some soldiers, and then people have that identity. And so it's not something you can unteach them. It's just something that they have to experience, have to live through. And once that changes, then I think the identity can begin to change.
I would like to rack this a very small point. I agree with many things that you say, but you have to understand that what you mentioned about 1914 and the anti-Zionist attitude of some publications or newspaper, Palestinian newspaper, was led by effendis that had the money and the influence. And some of these effendis were tax collectors, like Hajimel Husseini and the others. And they were collecting money from the Falahin for the land and for taxes. And when the Zionists came, they gave work to the Falahin to work for them in agriculture and in building. And they didn't pay any rental to the effendis. And this is why Hajimel Husseini and others started to incite about the Zionists. And this is all the conflict started because of greed of these people. And there was no real reason for the greed. In 1936, I know a family from Bidia that said to Hajimel al-Husseini, what do you want from the Jews? They are bringing prosperity to the country. It's good for us. And then he burned their house, and later they have to live here. In the riots of 1936 to 1939, not because of the Jews. They didn't have any army, and everything that they had was minor. There were more than 10 times Palestinian refugees that fled away from Jamal al-Husseini and all these gangs. And this was the reason for the hatred. The Jews had to respond, they had to protect themselves. You know that Hajime al-Husseini, he met with Hitler. He refused to the request of Eichmann to send the Jews from Europe to here to the country. And that's why Hitler selected the solution of the Holocaust. You have to understand what your crooks have done to you and to us. And we have to finish this, to end this, and people will hear about it, will not continue to be silent, will not continue to be ignorant of what happened here. You will hear about it. And this will be end to this tragedy.
Okay, I mean, I'm not sure I agree on Hajime al-Husseini's encouraging Hitler to do the Holocaust, but he definitely discouraged people from sending Holocaust refugees here. At the same time, I feel that the Zionists needed to do, they need to do a better job in communicating with the Palestinians of a vision that included them in this country here that was a Jewish state, and maybe that wasn't expressed well enough. But that's, I think that's then. In terms of now, I think if we're going to talk about a common narrative, be it Isaac and Ishmael or the Hebrew origins, I think it needs to come in tandem with a solution, a political resolution to the conflict. You can't base the acceptance of like, we'll live in a state with you if you agree that you're Israelites, or we agree with that you're Hebrews. I don't think that's fair in a sense. But I think that once, if you do it at the same time, you're saying, listen, either way, we're gonna make one country and live as equals here. And then, while we're at it, let's come up with a common narrative and learn a little bit about our Jewish roots, and we'll learn about your Arab culture, and we'll try to find a balance for how we're gonna live together. I think that's sort of a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I mean, I there's too much, like, I share the sentiment, but there's just too much I disagree with to feel like I could give it enough of an answer. And I also don't want to derail too far from the topic of the conversation, that this is supposed to be about. So I can just say what we believe is we see that modern Zionism, political Zionism, Herzl, Max Nodau in particular, and even sort of later down the line, like Jabotinsky and stuff, had little to no regard for the Palestinian locals, who they saw as having only possession rights and no right to concentrate in the region. And they saw themselves, returning there as the people they were interested in, that mattered. It's not like they showed up to the Landsvi and said, "Oh, these people are our brothers. This is what we're here to build a nation together," or whatever. With the exception, like Brit Shalom, there wasn't really a group that thought that way. There was very much a sense that it was their land, their country, and or that they needed at least to establish a state there, and a focus on sort of the Der Judenstaat idea of what was important about that state. So you have like Ahad Ha'am later down the line with cultural Zionism that has slightly different viewpoints, but ultimately this ideological difference is what made it so that the Effendis and the Mutasalims, the tax collectors and the ruling class, the politicians, were able to saw this movement as a threat. They saw this immigration as not like the Armenians or a bunch of other groups that have moved to the land. They saw this as unique. That in this case, they were going to topple the ruling class of the country, but also impose a demographic control over the land, and that control would only apply to those who were identifying as Jewish. That these were the people who would have sort of superior rights in the land, and they rejected that. And, they began to reject that as early as the 1900s, and then by the time Balfour happened, it was seen as a confirmation that everything they'd been, say, all these, people had been telling us, Isa al-Isa and Al-Karmil and Palestine, like Palestinian newspaper, was true. And though we were right, these people weren't refugees, they weren't immigrants, they weren't here just to bring us, because as you said, many people did business with the Jewish immigrants in the first and second Aliyah, and they had no problem with them. And so they were very happy that they were there. And even I mentioned the case of the Zaidanis. Zahar al-Omar, for example, who I've actually chosen my alias based on, he wanted to promote Jewish immigration from Syria and Aleppo, and so the shift happened when we saw a European political movement with you can disagree that it was colonialist, but all their tactics, all their behaviors, how they acted towards the locals, they saw us as primitive, and they treated us, in that same way. They had very little regard for our villages, very little regard for our way of life and our culture. And they didn't extend a bridge to say that, oh, we're the same people. There were figures that did, but they were a minority. The majority just shifted into pragmatic Zionism, began to build, said we'll deal with it later. And as soon as the conflict erupted, they saw it as a chance to transfer is the word they used, ethnically cleanse is the word I use, that population out of the land. And so what you're doing now is trying to I basically, you would have a harder time convincing your own people of this idea, because I don't think the Palestinian identity ever really cared as much about whether someone was Jewish or not. I think it was really just we've just created an identity based around the name, one of the names of the land that represents our struggle, and it kind of refers to everyone except this state. I mean, it fundamentally disconnects itself from the Israeli state and the history of the Israeli state, rather than whether someone is Jewish or Arab or Samaritan or Armenian. That's what I think in a nutshell. But I'll avoid going back and forth on it, because I get the sentiment of what Tsvi is trying to say. I just think there's a huge narrative gap between the two sides. I don't think we're going to bridge in this conversation, but I think what I can agree on is the common history that goes back to ancient roots, highlighting to both sides that the connection to land that these groups of people have, and the tragedy of the conflict to date, as well as their story, because yes, the story of there are many Palestinians with Samaritan or Jewish roots, and most Palestinians don't know how big a percentage of Israel is actually Mizrahi. They have a very similar culture. They have Arab. They've been in the Middle East for thousands of years. How long Jews lived in Baghdad or in Syria? So highlighting that history changes the way people feel about the other. A very good example of this is Wasif Jawhari. Wasif Jawhari. He spoke about Abna al-Balad, is what he referred to. He referred to the Jewish people who had been in the Middle East this whole time as Abna al-Balad, and the ones who and he basically felt a connection to them, and the ones who had embraced European culture as being outsiders. So I can see what Tsvi's saying about how culture and identity can kind of define your narrative, and forming a common culture and identity definitely is the way forward. I just think when it comes to historical narrative, or how people see the conflict, or who's to blame, the differences there are probably too large to bridge in one or two or even a dozen of these conversations. So I'll probably leave it at that.
All right. Thanks, guys. Adar, I don't know if you want to come.
Yeah, pop on.
What's up?
Hi, Adar.
That was very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we're 2 hours. Whoa, how time flies.
Yeah.
I need another minute. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, final thoughts.
Tsvi, we're going to give you the final word here as our guest. So the final word is all yours, and then we're going to move it on to the after party. For those who want to join the after party, I will put a link to our Discord in the chat. Join us. You'll see on the left-hand side it says lounge. Click lounge. You'll be connected via voice. You don't need to speak. You could just type. There's a place to type as well. We'd love to see you there. The after parties are wild. Tsvi, all you, friend.
Okay. Zahir, I agree with many things that you said. On one hand, there was the greed. On the other hand, was a difference of culture by the Jews that came from Europe. There's no argument about it. but today we live together already for a long period. Many Jews came from Arab countries, and the assimilation of culture and the understanding of the people, not of the leaderships, is much better than was 100 years ago or 80 years ago. And this is why it will be easier to resolve this issue now, and this is why it was not impossible to resolve it then. But now that we educate people about everything happens, and the Ashkenazi Jews that came from Europe, their contribution to the local culture is very important. The Arab world is in a disaster, most of it now. Only the oil saved some of them. And the European culture to come and make a melting pot with the Arab or Middle Eastern culture is very important to create a superior culture that we can again in the Middle East become the center of the world. It will not happen in a year and not even in 10 years, but in 20, 40 years it can happen. That's it.
Inshallah, amen.
Thank you, Tsvi. Thank you. It was great having you, Tsvi. If you still have more time, I'd love for you to join the after party as well. There'll be a lot of people there who maybe want to ask you questions. If not, I'm sure we could do something again in the near future. Whoever's new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. We have actually 3 more live streams this week, so it's a busy week for us. A lot of interesting things. Tomorrow we have an Armenian-Azerbaijan debate. After that, we have a live stream with Mordechai Kedar. And then on Thursday, we have a debate with Zahir and Gershon Baskin. So very busy week. Community chat, I hope to see you all there. Signing off.
Amazing.